One night, I was camping in the backcountry near where I lived. I'm not much of a hiker, so I never go on trails more than a mile or two. This one was just over a mile from the campsite to the trailhead where my car was parked. I had been spending the weekend there, camping out by the lake, and was planning to stay for another 2 nights. On the 3rd day, I spent the morning hiking back to my truck to grab my fishing rod and some extra food, then hiked back to the camp. I figured I'd try fishing while I had the time. When I got back to the camp, though, I noticed another tent set up farther down on the edge of the lake. I didn't see anyone around it at first. I didn't think much of it, but it did cross my mind that I hadn't seen anyone on the only trail leading to this part of the lake. Then again, there might have been another path I wasn't aware of. Whatever the case, I set up my rod and started fishing. Every 20 minutes or so, I glanced over at the tent by the lake, but during the 3 hours I was out there, I never saw anyone. As the sun began to set, I packed up my rod and returned to my tent. I ate some food and gathered sticks for the campfire, then waited for it to get a little darker before lighting it up. As soon as I did, I saw someone's shadow move in the forest ahead of me. They were just far enough away that the light didn't reach them, so after that quick glimpse, all I could see was darkness. I assumed it was the person with the tent down by the lake, probably gathering sticks for a fire. It was odd that they were right outside my camp just as I lit up my fire, but I decided not to overthink it. I leaned back in my chair and relaxed, looking at the fire, the sky, and the lake. It was so calming that I almost wanted to fall asleep in the chair. But just half an hour later, I looked past the fire and saw several figures coming out of the forest. Once they were closer, I counted 4 men, all heading straight for my campsite. A lot was going through my mind, but I tried to stay calm and hoped they were just a nearby camping group in need of help or something. When they stepped into the light, I saw they were all in their 30s or 40s, with serious expressions. As they got just a few feet from me and kept walking, I stood up from my chair and nervously started asking what they needed. None of them answered. They just kept walking up. 2 of them went behind me, heading straight for my tent, while the other 2 pushed me aside. There was no doubt what was happening now, but I knew fighting back would only make things worse. I watched as the 2 men began searching through my stuff, while the other 2 kept pushing me further away from the campsite and away from the light. I tried saying anything I could think of, but the men had a cold, empty look in their eyes that showed they didn't care at all. I kept telling myself to stay calm and let them take whatever they wanted, but the 2 men kept pushing and dragging me further and further out into the dark forest. After a minute, I could barely see where we were going, and the only sound I could hear was our footsteps in the silent woods. Then we stopped. I turned to face them, and as we stood there in the dark between the trees, all my fears hit me at once. One of them reached for something, and I immediately took off running. All I could hear were my footsteps pounding against the leaves and grass as I ran. I still had a general sense of direction, so I aimed to get back to the trail. When I reached it, I headed straight for my truck, and from what I could tell, nobody followed me. I reported the incident to the police, but in the end, almost all my gear was stolen, and there was no trace left to identify who those men were. What they were planning to do when they dragged me into the forest is probably obvious, so I think I was incredibly lucky to have made it out with my life. I used to go camping a lot with some friends from college, but after we graduated, it became impossible to coordinate our schedules. Everyone was always busy, so I ended up going out on my own. There was a campground we used to visit often, so I decided to play it safe and go back to that same place. It was a bit remote and not easy to get to, which is why I liked it. No one else would be there since there were easier spots nearby to camp. I knew the route well, so I got there without any trouble and set up my gear. Not long after, a man showed up. He looked like any other hiker but only had a small backpack, so he definitely wasn't equipped for camping. The only thing that made me question why he was there was that this wasn't a particularly scenic spot. It was a nice place to camp because of the open space surrounded by trees, but if you weren't camping, there wouldn't be much reason to hike all the way out here. I didn't think too much about it at the time since the guy seemed normal enough. Maybe he just wanted a quiet place to relax for a while. I stayed by my tent while the man stayed on the other side of the campground. Around 6 p.m., I walked away from my tent to cook some food, and it was around this time that I saw the man finally leave. I thought it was a little late to start hiking back since it would be completely dark in less than an hour, and the hike was probably about 3 hours. But other than that, I was just glad to be alone. I boiled some water with my mini stove and made one of those freeze-dried meals, then went back near my tent and sat down. The sun was almost gone, so I brought out a small lantern and hung it on the side of the tent as I sat outside and soaked in the atmosphere. Suddenly, it hit me that I was alone out there, and usually this would be the time when we'd all gather around and talk by a campfire. But by myself, I didn't really have much to do. After a while, I turned off the lantern and went inside my tent, laying down and calling it a night. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps nearby. When I opened my eyes, it was pitch black, and I had no idea how long I'd been asleep. The footsteps got closer and closer until they stopped on the other side of the campground. After a few seconds, I felt around for my lantern, turned it on, unzipped the tent, and looked out. About 20 feet from my tent, I saw the shape of a man standing right where I had seen the guy from earlier. From what I could make out, it was probably the same person. But he was just standing there, not doing anything. It was late enough at night that this was immediately unsettling, no matter the context, and since I had turned my lantern on, he definitely saw me. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out to him. I waited a few seconds, but he didn't react in any way. I couldn't even tell which direction he was facing. He was either facing away from me or directly at me, and I don't know which one was more unsettling. I reached for my pocket knife from my backpack and did the only thing I could do, which was sit there and wait. The most nerve-wracking 15 minutes of my life passed as I watched this man standing there, barely moving, before he suddenly turned and walked off in the same direction he had gone before. As he turned, I could see from the way his figure moved that he had been facing me the whole time, which meant he had just been staring at me. I felt chills as his footsteps grew fainter and eventually disappeared into the distance. I didn't know what else to do except stay up in case he came back. As far as I know, he never did. I left the next morning and made it back safely, but I haven't been camping since. I don't know what that man was up to, but there's no way that wasn't extremely disturbing. Maybe I scared him off by waking up and watching him to make sure he didn't try anything, but it terrifies me to think about what could have happened if I hadn't woken up. Several years ago, my brother Jason and I relocated to Colorado, both drawn to the idea of living near the mountains. Since neither of us could afford it on our own, we decided to share the rent on a townhouse in a suburb just outside Denver. This arrangement was ideal, as it placed us only 10 to 15 minutes away from a vast stretch of mountains. One thing to note about these nearby hiking and camping trails is that they are quite crowded. Being so accessible to locals and tourists alike, it's almost impossible to find solitude at any time of the year. To escape the crowds, Jason and I decided to plan a 3-day backpacking trip, hoping to find some peace and quiet. I trusted him to map out our journey, and a couple of weeks later, we drove to the trailhead. When we arrived, we noticed just one other vehicle parked there. An old, dust-covered SUV that looked like it had seen better days. With the assumption that only one other person was hiking this route, we began our adventure with a positive attitude. The first day involved an 8-mile hike, most of which was relatively flat until we reached the last few miles, where we began ascending a mountainside. It was exhausting, but Jason assured me that the campsite would be worth the effort, and he was right. About 3/4 of the way up the mountain, we found a small, flat area right on the cliffside with a breathtaking view of the entire valley. The sight was particularly stunning as the sun began to set. After soaking in the view, we set up our tents and gathered some sticks and stones to build a fire pit. Once the fire was crackling, we sat down and chatted, losing track of time. We had been talking for at least a couple of hours when we suddenly heard something on the trail. We immediately fell silent, listening as footsteps approached our campsite. A minute later, a man emerged from the darkness and into the faint light of our fire. He wasn't wearing a headlamp, which every hiker and camper knows is essential if there's a chance of being out in the dark. As he approached, both Jason and I sensed something was off. The man had a grin on his face as he stepped closer to the fire. "Do you need something?" Jason asked, standing up. The man looked at Jason, then at me, all the while maintaining that unsettling grin. He claimed to be a park ranger and said he had been following our trail for a while. According to him, this section of the park was closed for the season, and we weren't supposed to be there. However, something felt very wrong. We knew the park was open, and we had even obtained permits from the state the day before. Additionally, park rangers wouldn't typically be out on a mountain trail at night. If this man wasn't who he claimed to be, then what was he doing out here? Jason's mind was clearly racing, just like mine, as we both stared at the man and began asking him questions. But he quickly cut us off. "You both need to leave with me right now. Pack up and follow me, and I'll guide you back to the trailhead," he insisted. We stood there in silence, processing his words and realizing something was seriously wrong. The man continued to linger by the fire, still grinning. "No, we're staying here," Jason finally said. The man looked at Jason, then at me, maintaining that eerie grin before turning around and walking away. Terrified, we didn't speak for several minutes, listening intently to ensure he didn't return. Then we gathered more dry sticks and rekindled the fire. Neither of us slept that night, occasionally hearing what we thought were footsteps but never seeing the man again. At sunrise, we packed up and left, cutting our trip short and retracing our steps back to the car. When we returned, that same dusty SUV was still there, making us wonder if the other hiker had encountered the same man and what might have happened to them. We reported the incident to the police, but nothing came of it. There was no doubt the man had lied about being a park ranger, and the fact that he tried to lead us into the woods in the middle of the night suggested he had sinister intentions. What those intentions were, we'll never know, but it's possible that the other hiker wasn't as fortunate as we were.